now like to introduce Darran, Jordan and Rocco Bosco. Strange Adventures in Ficto-Archaeology, Narrative Forms, Academic Intentions and Ficto-Critical Outcomes.
Afternoon everyone. I'd just like to start by recognising the traditional owners of the land and elders past and present. So what is archaeology? Many of the books on the discipline begin with a definition on the subject, but many of these definitions are wildly different from each other. The nature of archaeology to a practitioner often depends largely on their own area of interest, on what they hope to gain with the tools of the discipline. While one archaeologist may focus on reconstructing human actions of the past, another may be more interested in large-scale, long-term material change, traced through monument structures and settlement patterns. Archaeology allows for multiple approaches, and considering the differing finds, conditions, challenges and contexts encountered on archaeological sites around the world, different approaches, theories and intentions are very appropriate. The general public at large is presented with numerous images of archaeology through popular culture discourses, and so prevalent are the visuals and concepts presented to them that there is often an assumption of being well informed, despite the layers of mythology and disinformation that cover a variety of gaps and omissions. In film and television narratives, viewers are treated to characters like Indiana Jones and Lara Croft. There are even comic book superheroes like Dr. Fate, Blue Beetle, Hawkman and Adam Strange, all archaeologists in their secret identities. Such fictional constructs have very little to do with the reality of archaeology, but a lot to do with what the general public perceives archaeology to be. As a result, it can blind many to the elements of history and archaeology that surround them in their everyday lives, as well as its social and personal significance. In response to this, some academics, historians and archaeologists have chosen to utilise the tools of popular culture for academic ends, adopting ficto-critical approaches to archaeology. Interpretive archaeology blends scientific results with humanity's outcome, utilising imagination to shape data into a narrative form. Spector's 1993 work of feminist archaeology, What This All Means, drew heavily on imagination and creativity as tools of archaeological reconstruction. Spector stated that only the act of the imagination can provide such access to reconstruct the world that these remains imply. What makes it fiction is the nature of the imaginative act, to yield up a kind of truth. In 2010, the AAA conference hosted a session on materiality and narrative, constructing stories of people and place from objects. This saw Sarah Colley's Fishbone video, Annie Clark's Marooned, The Old People, a Dolphin and a Model Canoe, and Tom Sapienza's use of narrative reconstruction in the materiality of plainware pottery in Polynesia. There was even a narrative told from the perspective of a cake of spinifex resin by Heidi Pittman. Dennis Byrne has produced numerous papers on ficto-critical archaeology, and in 2012, Annie Clark and Ursula Frederick convened a workshop on contemporary archaeology that highlighted both multidisciplinary and creative approaches. Imaginative and creative tools can be used to great effect in archaeology, but fiction yields varying types of truth. Popular culture representations of archaeology are often more telling of wider cultural mythologies than of any intrinsic truth about the discipline, something that has been theorised by Holthoff and taught by Hiscock at the ANU course Archaeology in Film and Fiction. Representations of archaeology in popular forms seldom work towards communicating archaeological messages to a wider audience, despite the fact that creative forms are those most likely to succeed in communicating such messages to the widest audience possible. My own past academic works have explored the varying narratives that coalesce around mythologized archaeology. I looked at representations of archaeologists in comic books and also examined popular culture in Angkor, specifically mythologized narratives in the fictional spaces of contemporary video games. After concluding on numerous occasions that erroneous popular culture representations do have a direct impact on the academic intentions of archaeology as a discipline, and that there are benefits for the archaeologist to interact directly with popular genres and forms, it occurred to me that it was high time to put my money where my mouth is. Having established the potential benefits to undertaking a creative project that directly engages with a wider general public audience, communicating archaeologically specific concepts and intentions, the next step was to try out some of the ways this could be done. As well as being an archaeologist, I also have a background in creative writing and textual studies. Similarly, my colleague and collaborator on this project, Rocco Bosco, is a historian, teacher and fiction writer. We've collaborated together on numerous creative projects in the past, many of which have informed our work or been informed by our work and studies in history and archaeology. You can see here some pages from our past comic book works, collaborating with artists who illustrated our scripts. With this as our background, we decided to collaborate together on a project that specifically targeted the expression of archaeological ideas through a fictional narrative, with the intention of producing a work that would be presented not at an academic venue, but rather to a general public audience. The concept was developed to create a short film that represented the archaeology and history of a targeted geographic area, with the intention that it be shown to the contemporary residents of that location, preferably to be screened within the very spaces of the environment that it was describing. In order both to produce the work and to have a venue in mind to present it at, we decided to seek support from the Blacktown Arts Centre. The idea was to create a narrative about the history and archaeology of the Western Sydney suburb of Blacktown in New South Wales. We created a proposal for a project that we titled Voices from the Black, pitching the notion of a narrative that incorporated into it different kinds of voices from the past. The types of stories would not just be those of groups and individuals drawn from historic sources, but more importantly from an archaeological perspective, would also include tales of material, built structures and landscape elements. No formal consultation process was undertaken for this project, but individuals from a variety of local Aboriginal groups were asked to provide input. In addition to this, past consultation reports for Blacktown and its surrounding suburbs were used as background research. The resulting information proved to be predominantly personal and recent, as opposed to references of cultural prehistory that were contained in published books and papers. Some of the individuals noted that the Blacktown area had developed to be almost unrecognisable since their own childhood days, with references to having ridden horses down dirt roads or worked on pastoral properties in areas that were now either residential or industrial. Other references were given to contemporary communal locations such as the Blacktown Workers' Club, described as being a place of social connection during years past. Recent historical events also played a part in the feedback received, with references to the Anita Cobby murder featuring as a traumatic event of the past. I myself have been told during consultation that the nature of lost connections to the past means that archaeological surveys can play a part in fostering reconnections for some members of the Aboriginal community. I don't know anything specific about this area, one Aboriginal woman stated to me. Part of the reason I come out on jobs like this is to find out, because for a lot of us, a lot of the information and stories haven't been passed on. I want to protect what is here, make sure it is recorded properly, and reconnect that way. With these themes emerging during our research, we sought a way to work them into a narrative. Prior to the writing of the script for the Voices from the Black film, it was essential to rediscover sites of archaeological importance in the contemporary built-up suburban area of Blacktown. We consulted various historic registers, the Ames Register, parish maps and historic aerials of the area. With consultation feedback, parish maps, historic aerials, the Ames coordinates and historic site listings at our disposal, a narrative structure was planned based on place. Connections in the landscape became links in the story. Physical structures used as metaphors to segue between both geographic and temporal locations. In order to further plan the content, we wanted to gain an understanding of the way the past continued to extrude into the present. In order to do this, we planned a number of site inspections of the various locations during September 2014. Archaeological survey techniques were employed as we undertook the walking of pedestrian transects along Bells Creek, across the publicly accessible park areas surrounding the Blacktown Native Institute, and at an Ames artefact scatter site in Falkland Crescent Reserve. Areas of exposure were targeted as we sought the surface expression of both historic and Aboriginal objects around the registered sites. This also provided the opportunity to identify contemporary development and use within these spaces, documenting the various layers of temporal use. Modern rubbish, the development of public parks and surrounding residential spaces, as well as the use of spaces for dog walking, games, jogging and even dirt bike riding, became a part of the scripted story after witnessing these during our inspections. Archaeology can tell stories about long periods of time by detaching from the human scale and examining material. Material changes can be much slower than human events, with building structures and locations utilised by multiple generations for a variety of changing purposes. The development of the narrative for this project sought to tell a story detached from the human scale, but able to take a sliding scale approach to time. The narrative hook we settled on was to start the story in contemporary times with the Blacktown Ghost Tour. This event is a historic tour taking place at St Bartholomew's Church and Cemetery. The Blacktown Council obviously recognised the fact that by setting it at night and calling it a ghost tour, they were likely to get larger numbers attending. From starting in the present at a defined geographic location, we're able to describe the contemporary mythology of ghosts as well as start to drift back in time via the headstone inscriptions. We're then able to describe deep time, moving into geological descriptions of the area due to the implied stratigraphic cuts of the graves. From this point then, human and geographic connections were made across the landscape without the need to set the story within one temporal location. The linking element we utilised was the land itself, describing it as one vast living story. Within that structure, we were able to contextualise both the past and the present within one consistent narrative, utilising archaeological approaches as a storytelling technique. The idea of perceiving the land in terms of story also tallied with historic accounts of Aboriginal people, songlines and Dreamtime stories, describing physical environment as a story. By referencing this in both content and approach, we sought to provide an insight into a way of seeing that is alien to many contemporary inhabitants of Blacktown. By mixing past and present in this narrative, it was an attempt to create a form that incorporated multiple elements of the Blacktown landscape, with contemporary locations used as touchstones linking to the past. By following the scale of the material rather than being limited to the human scale of verbal meaning, we were able to expand the narrative scope of the piece. Physical markers were used, such as the first Blacktown School, St Bartholomew's Church and Cemetery, Richmond Road and the train line. Even West Point Shopping Centre featured in the work, a contemporary focal point literally surrounded by historic locations. The work was researched and written with reference to physical locations within the contemporary environment. The approach to filming followed organically from the scripting, with footage consisting of visiting each of the locations that featured in the text. Since the ghost tour started off the story, we wanted to start visually with images of St Bartholomew's Church and graveyard by night. Innocently, we went along to take some night shots, only to set off the motion detection security alarm, the wailing sirens forcing us to flee for fear of angry security forces. As we continued filming, we became aware of a recurring visual theme, as metal fencing, keep-out signs, barbed wire and padlocks separated us from the spaces of the historic past, including St Bartholomew's Church, where two sides of individual graves were often split by fencing. The Blacktown Native Institute was similarly fenced off from access. We utilised this visual motif of separation, segregation, and forgetting as part of the film, focusing on these images and editing them prominently into the film. We also edited in sections of artist Lillian Hambley, illustrating images and concepts of the past environments, filming her producing her artwork as a kind of performance art approach to past reconstruction. One of the intentions of this work was to provide exposure for elements of the past not widely known by contemporary inhabitants of the area. Visually, it was our initial intention to capture the past in the film by having contemporary artists interpret both historical and Aboriginal elements through their art-making practices, capturing the creative process in the film and dispersing it with footage taken at the contemporary locations. One of the limitations of the capacity of what we could achieve, however, was the small budget we had to work with, one that was enough for research, writing and some development costs, but did not extend to hiring artists, actors and professional filmmakers. The piece was filmed and edited by Rocco and myself. I produced the soundtrack and together we voiced it, with a small section even read by my wife. This draft film was to be provided to the Blacktown Arts Centre in order to secure further funding. We had originally hoped to have two artists produce art for the footage, an Aboriginal artist to represent the prehistory and a second artist to recreate historic scenes. Due to the limitations of budget, however, the visual art element in this first version of the film was only provided by Rocco's colleague Lillian Hambley. Obviously, this raises questions of inclusion and exclusion and the right of non-Aboriginal people to fictionalise the Aboriginal past. Our attention to detail in research and use of consultation was our way of incorporating the past in a representative way. But if further funding becomes available in the future, it is our intention to utilise one or more local Aboriginal artists in the visual component. The Blacktown Arts Centre had a limited showing of the film in their gallery area and were very positive about what we had produced. The curator at the Blacktown Arts Centre has told us that he intends to obtain further funding from Blacktown Council in order to commission an expansion of the work, which would include refilming with a local Aboriginal artist in the footage and professional actors for the voiceovers. Alas, due to cutbacks to their funding capacity, it is currently uncertain if these are viable options, and the work remains in the meantime in limbo as we wait to hear further from the curator. Ficto-Archaeology can be utilised as a tool to reach a wider audience than academic papers are able to. However, ours is a cautionary tale, since funding is required to produce professional work, and without it, it may not reach any audience at all. We had hoped and planned to see our film projected in the actual spaces and landscape that we described in the work. If this eventually goes ahead, it will open up the archaeological content of the area to a wider general audience. By showing it in Blacktown, the residents who pass by these locations and structures regularly will have the opportunity to realise the way in which the past intrudes into their present. Rocco and I have worked on a variety of creative projects before. This was our first foray into utilising archaeological approaches to shape a narrative with specific academic intentions. Certainly we have learned a lot through the process and plan to incorporate our archaeological and historical knowledge and experience into further creative projects in the future. Thank you.